Hi, my name is Max Johnson, and my presentation will be about habitat fragmentation and its effects on ecosystems. So, when talking about this issue, it's important to define fragmentation as there are many different ways in which habitat can be lost, and they occur by different means and have varying degrees of severity. So, there are three terms that usually come into play, which are loss, destruction, and fragmentation. Habitat loss is defined as the complete removal of an area from an ecosystem rather than just simply being damaged. It is entirely gone. You usually see this with large developments like shopping malls, deforestation, the filling in of swamps, or any other means which completely remove an area from being habitable by wildlife that once lived there. Habitat destruction is somewhere in between habitat fragmentation and loss, in that it's become uninhabitable for one of many reasons. It can be recovered, but at the time being, the ecosystem that once existed there is not able to persist. This can be for a variety of reasons, like changes in climate, invasive species, the presence of pollution, any of these other factors that make a habitat unsuitable. Now, fragmentation, which is the topic of this presentation, is the division of larger habitat landscapes into much smaller, more isolated habitats by urbanization and human developments. Now, while this habitat still technically exists, it's disconnected in ways that don't allow movement of species that once had a much larger area to live off of. This tends to limit their resources, leads to genetic problems, and overall can lead to population extinction in areas that once had thriving wildlife. Now, the reason that habitat fragmentation is such a big issue is that many see it as a solution to avoiding habitat destruction or loss, when in reality it's actually a silent killer causing just as much damage or more so than direct destruction. For this project, to gain a better understanding of the issue, I reached out to Hunter Johnson, who has been a steering committee member for the Colorado Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, as well as a field technician for adaptation and environmental services.
My name is Hunter Johnson. I'm a wildlife biology student at Colorado State University. Been involved in conservation biology work for the last 8 years. I've done a lot of work along the Front Range of Colorado, specifically involving reptiles, amphibians, and their habitats and ecosystems.
Hunter has personally seen the effects of fragmentation in many different environments all across the state. So, fragmentation can actually occur in a lot of different ways with a lot of different impacts on the environment. As the population continues to grow, we find ourselves needing more and more areas for housing, which leads to neighborhood developments, and soon after follows larger constructions like malls, office parks, industrial sites, and anything else that comes along with heavy population centers. One of the most obvious and widespread forms of fragmentation is roadways, major highways, that lead to the disconnect of landscapes because wildlife simply aren't able to cross without risking any fatality to themselves.
Habitat fragmentation can be caused by a lot of different things. It can be everything from a little trailhead that gets used by recreationalists to basically a city. Anything in between there can be habitat fragmentation. That can be varying degrees as well, whereas you have roads, it could be a county dirt road. That's a form of fragmentation. Anything up to a highway, which is going to be much bigger detrimental fragmentation. And you see that as different levels. And as use becomes more common, as that landscape continues to be changed, and different degrees of size also affect the habitat fragmentation and the severity of its impacts.
One of the greatest misconceptions about habitat fragmentation is that the presence of open spaces or large areas in general is simply enough for the wildlife in them and is suitable for their thriving, when in fact a lot of biological processes require the movement of species over larger areas of land. So the issue is really not about total acreage, but rather connected acreage of land.
Some of the biggest effects on wildlife include loss of genetic diversity. You also have disruption of migration routes. You can have trophic collapses in general, and you can also have things like producer and consumer population size changes that negatively affect the rest of the ecosystem.
One of the main processes that are interrupted by habitat fragmentation is migration patterns. Migration is essential for many types of birds, reptiles, and amphibians in order to survive the winters. But as we're seeing an increase in global temperature, a lot of species whose habitats were once suitable are actually becoming much too warm for their existence. So, in an attempt to find new, much cooler areas, uh, many species that are not necessarily known to migrate have actually started trying to move into new areas. But because of habitat fragmentation, there's not enough connectedness of landscape for them to be able to find these new grazing areas. Now, the driving force behind evolution is actually the genetic variation of a species, the ability of a species to spread more desirable traits amongst its future generations for better adaptation and survival is essential for a species to continue. Now, what you see with these fragmented areas is that subpopulations are not able to interbreed simply because they're so disconnected. This means that not only are you not allowing the species to evolve, uh, you start to see inbreeding in the future generations, which causes harmful genetic mutations and shortens the overall life expectancy of the population. And even if this situation is trying to be rectified, it's usually to the point where the species is so inbred and genetically different from any outside populations that you end up with them being unable to interbreed with one another, and this continued inbreeding will get worse and worse. Both the inability to migrate and the lack of genetic variation can lead to reduced population sizes, which risks the possibility of trophic collapse.
Trophic collapses are essentially when you have a change in a keystone species or an indicator species. For me, a lot of the times it's the amphibians, sometimes it can be reptiles, but these are species that are essential to the ecosystem. And when the habitat is fragmented, they see major changes and major problems. And once you remove or you have major losses in one of those groups, you start seeing the whole rest of the trophic cascade collapse.
So, one of the main things that happens with environmental issues is that they feel quite distant or disconnected from the people that learn about them, when this is in fact not the case with fragmentation. It has occurred all across the globe, including right here in Golden, Colorado. So, I sat down and I asked Hunter about some of the examples that he's seen in his field work in the Front Range.
So at North and South Table Mountain, that was a project that I helped on as a volunteer, but I was heavily involved in those projects, being a regular out there week in, week out. And what we did is we radio telemetried a bunch of rattlesnakes. We inserted through surgery these radio transmitters and then followed them around to see what it was like. North and South Table Mountain, as some of you may know, being from the Golden area, it are heavily recreated. They're super recreated parks, potentially the most so in the Front Range of Colorado, and therefore they have lots of trails. And another thing about them is that they're completely surrounded on, one of them is, South Table is completely surrounded by development through Coors Brewery. You have subdivisions, you have mines, you have a whole bunch of these other places. And then you go to North Table and it's almost all the same story, except there's one side that connects to the hogbacks over there. But either way, you have these perfectly fragmented areas of natural landscape. So that's gonna be a great case study for that. And what we did is we tracked these rattlesnakes and to see their habitat and how it was changed through the development of the Table Mountains. You see the mining that takes place on the top of North Table. You see that these they continually develop right up to the base of South Table. You see increasing amount of trails, whether that be developed or social trails. And so we're tracking these rattlesnakes as they come across, and it's incredible to see how they crisscross these whole areas. They get caught up. We saw some mortality rates where we lost animals because they were going through exposed areas that were heavily trafficked. And it was really interesting to see how these animals were reacting just to this recent development and this recent increase in influx in human traffic. And it's going to only get worse for them as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know. And I think that one of the things we have to be conscious of, and what we were doing in our work, is making sure that they noted where there was important areas, which would be denning sites where they spend overwintering, and then also rookeries, where rattlesnakes specifically take care of their young for the first 6 to 12 days of their life, and they're really sensitive spots. And you have to protect these, otherwise you're going to see massive mortality in the rattlesnake babies. And if you fragment those areas with trails, or if you end up building a road through it, South Table Mountain has a lot of development projects to make it more recreational friendly. Um, if any of that happens, you're going to see big changes in the rattlesnake population, which obviously you don't want on an open space that claims to be very green and friendly to the environment, but also wants to be recreationally friendly as well.
So, as you can see, fragmentation is definitely one of the greatest issues we face, especially as our need for development rises and we continue to urbanize practically untouched areas. As far as solutions go, there have been some projects that have started implementing wildlife corridors or wildlife bridges that allow for species to move from one segmented area to another. But the greatest solution that we can use is awareness and education about the issue, as it would serve better in the long run to proactively implement these types of passageways and means for wildlife to continue moving from area to area, as opposed to retroactively trying to come up with a solution, as by the time that we realize the effects of fragmentation, the damage is usually done and it often can't be reversed.
I think that it would be huge in helping wildlife and in floral composition and in ecosystem health and all of that if we can just get awareness into the developers, into the conservationist minds, into all these different planning departments in cities, in open spaces. As they go through this, they need to start thinking more and more about fragmentation as the main issue they're facing, as opposed to things like loss, as opposed to things like, oh, we're going to kill off this certain animal. There's a lot more that has to be considered when thinking about this, and I think awareness is going to be the biggest detriment to our ecosystems, to our health, to the health of wildlife, to conservation as we know it in the coming years if we don't get the awareness up.